Good evening, Stephen Helfer here, and the show is the smoking section. Last week I was away in Colorado, and I was very happy to take the train out to a place called Glenwood Springs, and of course there is a federal law that prohibits smoking on all trains, so it was a bit difficult, but I endured. And one of the things that really helped me was snus, which is a habit that's really nice to be in because I don't have to get off the train. But we do stop for smoke breaks along the way. Although sometimes the smoke breaks are hours apart from one another, so it can be quite difficult. I remember at one time in this country, trains were kind of almost like a partying area. People would drink and they would play guitar and they would smoke, and it was really a lot of fun to be on trains. It wasn't so much this kind of non-smoking, people very much involved with their electronic devices. They were very different. Trains were a very, very social experience. But for the smokers on the train, who tend to be more social than I would say the other people, it is still somewhat of a social experience. And I did meet a lot of people on the train, both smokers and non-smokers, but I really met some very interesting smokers on the train whom I gave the card for Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, and hope they will get in contact with us. But I'm glad to be back in Cambridge, and I hope the show that ran last week with Emily Ouija and Jeff Yalanesian was something that people enjoyed seeing. I'm sure it was a good show as I remember it, and I'm thankful to the staff here at CCTV who are fastidious enough to take the DVD and run it when I'm not here. Now, yesterday on Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights Facebook page, there was a really very, very good article written by someone who is either in a group or on a website called Smokers Against Discrimination. Actually, that may not be the correct name of the website, but I thought that I might go over some of the things he said, because even though many of the things he said I have heard before, I have thought before, it is actually quite, he put them in such a way that I think it really crystallized a certain amount of thinking about tobacco that is radically different from the social program that has been foisted upon the public, which kind of defines the way you are supposed to think about tobacco, think about smokers, think about tobacco companies. It's a whole kind of program that influences the way people think, and it's been unfortunately very successful. But then again, you might say it hasn't been successful because as my friend Paul Neff points out, in the year 1990, all of the anti-smoking forces, none of them, by the way, grassroots, they're all kind of authoritarian governmental or non-governmental organizations, got together and put out a paper called the Blueprint for Success, and they predicted that their goal was that by the year 2000, nobody would smoke, no one would use tobacco in America. And of course, millions upon millions of dollars of government money, of taxpayers' money, has been spent to lobby for ever more restrictive laws on smoking and anti-smoking propaganda. But still, close to 20% of American adults continue to smoke, continue to enjoy tobacco, and the last paragraph of this gentleman's article, his name is Ramzi Suda, he actually writes, rather than making me want to quit, this selfish exclusion and continual propaganda war on smokers has made me angry and determined to retain control over at least my own body. And that is very, very important. He is not allowing himself to internalize this propaganda and to think of himself as, oh, I am weak, I can't quit smoking, I should quit, my secondhand smoke bothers other people, all of these kinds of things. But he says, I am proud to be a smoker. It says I am strong, I make my own decisions, I am a free thinker, an individual, and I will face bullies. And there's no question that the anti-smoking forces, both within the government and in these large nonprofit organizations who don't pay taxes but have millions and millions of dollars in their war chests, have encouraged politicians and encouraged the public in general to look askance at us smokers and to try to inculcate in us a feeling that we are somehow less than human beings, even, really, and that we're somehow not the equal of non-smokers. And it's interesting because right now we're facing a opioid overdose epidemic. Everybody has heard about that, although I really don't think the word epidemic is right, because epidemic is something that really means something that's an infectious disease that you can catch from exposure to a germ or some kind of unsanitary thing. An epidemic is very, very different than something which people go out and actively take part in. People, no one catches a heroin addiction simply by being exposed to some kind of pathogen or something. It's something that he or she has to succumb to. And but without getting into that in great detail, it's really not an epidemic. This is something that is a new use of the word that describes something that that human beings, at least initially, are voluntarily experiment with and perhaps get entrapped by. But an epidemic is very different than that. But and everyone is now saying, well, people who are heroin addicts, that it's a disease, that they have no control, that the state or other forces need to intervene in, and they should be very much treated with a great deal of respect and that sort of thing. And yet on the smoking issue, public health authorities say, well, the more we stigmatize smokers, the more we make it socially unacceptable, so that, oh, you're a smoker, you're not a good person. That's the way to fight smoking. So it's interesting, something like heroin, which of course can render someone completely immobile, unable to work, unable to drive a car, unable to function in any of the most important aspects of life. We're going to treat that person with kindness and respect, whereas someone who smokes, which of course not only doesn't prevent one from having children, from performing a job, from driving a car, we're going to treat that person poorly. So that's an interesting change, or an interesting, let's say, it's ironic that now we're supposed to treat people who are addicted to heroin as if they are possessed by a disease, and we should treat them with a great deal of respect, whereas we treat those of us who smoke as somehow socially unacceptable. But to go on with this article and to kind of present some of the points that Mr. Suda has made. He has been smoking for 35 years and says that he's not addicted, that he enjoys smoking, that it's a matter of choice. And he points out that to compare it to heroin is not only offensive, but what I think is very, very important point that he makes is that it is irresponsible and dangerous. So we are completely inundated with this anti-smoking propaganda that says more smokers die from smoking than people die from heroin overdoses or car accidents or AIDS. But these numbers are really, really misleading, because even if you believe what they say, that these diseases that are caused by smoking are in fact caused by smoking, it almost always happens to people in their 70s or 80s, or sometimes even in their 90s. Whereas these other things, automobile accidents, overdoses, AIDS, suicide, homicide, are very, very prevalent in people in their teens and 20s and 30s. So it's a very, very different kind of thing. Perhaps smoking does slightly increase some of one's risk for certain illnesses, but it's over a 40 or 50-year period, not when the person is young and in the full bloom of life. But I think it is important here where Mr. Suda says that it's actually irresponsible and dangerous to send that kind of message. I think of an example that just happened today, where I read in the paper that this young man named Zach Marr, let's see, how do we get that? That this young man named Zach Marr, I don't know if you can see him, all of these posters have been up around looking for him, because he was out celebrating his 22nd birthday several weeks ago, and he went missing, and he was at a bar, and probably he was intoxicated, and he fell in or jumped into the harbor in his state of intoxication, and they've just found his body today. Now, my guess is that his parents didn't mind him drinking a bit, they didn't mind him driving, all of these things that really are more dangerous, far more dangerous than smoking. Yet if he had been a cigarette smoker, they may have been aghast at his cigarette smoking. So those things that are really, really dangerous to young people we are losing sight of, and something like smoking, which in fact is not dangerous to young people at all. Again, because even if you believe all of the diseases that are supposedly caused by smoking, it's over a 40 or 50-year period. And so this is a point that is lost, I think, and by exaggerating the dangers of smoking, it makes particularly parents and others minimize the dangers of other things: car driving, alcohol, drugs, violence, gun violence, and the real dangers to young people are these things, not smoking. And again, Mr. Suda has been smoking 35 years and is in very good health. And one would expect that, if smoking is what they say it is, which is supposedly lethal, you don't do anything for 35 years. If it's lethal, by that time, it should have at least damaged your health. Of course, I'm thinking of the famous musician Compay Segundo, who actually had been smoking cigars for, I'm trying to think how long he smoked cigars for. He smoked cigars for about 90 years. And he did succumb, but again, he was 95 years old. And, And Mr. Sudat also points out that in recent times, when you could light up in a cafe, restaurant, cinema, aircraft, hospital, or office, the person next to you, who could be a non-smoker, never so much as noticed. Smoking was a part of everyday life. And now we've eliminated that, or they've worked so hard to eliminate that, and people have become hypersensitive to smoking with all of the propaganda, with never coming in contact with tobacco smoke. People have developed this kind of hypersensitivity to it that is very neurotic. And this is something that one can develop for any kind of stimulation. Like, people can become very hypersensitive to noise, or hypersensitive to dust, or hypersensitive to dirt. And along with that, and I don't know if there's a causal relationship or not, but we have seen so many things increase that are not good. For example, I was just reading that since 1980, the rate of diabetes in the United States has increased 175%. Now, the single most important risk factor for diabetes, at least for type 2 diabetes, is overweight. And smoking has scientifically and been a long thought to be something that helps people control weight. So it should be as no surprise that since 1980, the rate of diabetes has increased 175% in the United States. And what is probably a little bit more surprising is that the rate of asthma in the United States has increased likewise in the same dramatic way. So when health authorities say that somehow if we eliminate tobacco use, we are going to save all kinds of money and the population is going to get so healthy, we can see that it is clearly not the case. And then if you look, of course, at something that I brought up before, is that women smoking when pregnant, which was very common up until the, let's say, 80s, again, 1980 approximately. The rate of autism was less, rate of asthma less, fewer food allergies, fewer cesarean sections because babies weren't as big, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of illnesses that we are getting now in this country that seem, to me at least, related to the decline in smoking. Certainly, I think people are less sociable, less easygoing, a lot of rates of, for example, road rage, impatience, all of these kinds of things. And remember that tobacco has been around for about 8,000 years, revered by the American Indian. So we're not talking about something that was foisted upon the American public, let's say, 100 years ago. We're talking about something that has been part and parcel of the New World experience for 8,000 years, according to historians. So he also, Mr. Sudat, talks about secondhand smoke, and he mentions that when he sat with his grandparents, they would smoke up to 60 cigarettes a day in rooms that were closed, no windows open, and no one seemed to mind. No red eyes, no coughing, etc. He also says that he is now 48 years old and in good health, so evidently this secondhand smoke that he was exposed to so strenuously as a child did not appear to affect him. But one thing he says I do kind of disagree with, and that is, he says the science of secondhand smoke, despite what we're fed by political propaganda, is still not settled. You know, I think he is actually being a little weak there. I mean, in fact, the science is settled. Michael McFadden makes a very good point of this, is that in the in the EPA's 1992 report, which is an exhaustive report on secondhand smoke, which was thrown out by a judge as being totally manipulated to come up with a preconceived conclusion. But even so, if you look at the risk that the EPA report concluded secondhand smoke caused by all rigorous or scientific standards, it was such that it showed that there was no risk. The risk was so small that it was statistically insignificant. And so Michael McFadden is very right. If you took that report and you read its conclusions, you would have to conclude that secondhand smoke is harmless. Now, people may not like secondhand smoke, they may find it irritating, but to claim there is any kind of measurable health effect from being exposed to secondhand smoke for even 30 or 40 years in a home where there is secondhand smoke is such that the evidence, the scientific evidence of the EPA, if you look at it objectively, is that there is no increased disease risk from secondhand smoke that would be considered significant scientifically. And Mr. Sudak goes on to say that, mention some of the stigmatization that is associated with the anti-smoking movement. So, for example, certain medical officials and doctors are denying treatment or refusing to treat people who continue to smoke, even if they have something that's totally unrelated. So, for example, if you have a broken leg, they will give you a hard time about your smoking and even threaten not to treat you. So this has become something that is really going to the point where it's called, what sociologists called a moral panic. That is where a whole society somehow gets taken up in a kind of witch hunt and begins to think that every problem they can think of is associated, at least every health problem they can think of is associated with something like smoking. So these are all very good points and very well put by this gentleman, Ramsey Suda. And I think it's something that we should all think about. And of course, I don't think, and I think it behooves us, any of us, whether you smoke or not, to recognize what is going on here and to recognize that this is a threat, an authoritarian threat to our liberty and to any kind of good standard of scientific research. Science is a very political endeavor, as I have mentioned before on the show, but there is nothing more politicized than the science against smoking. Like, I remember one of the last times I was on the show, it's not just smoking, but it is, for example, Sherry, who works here as a cablecaster, said to me, oh, well, smoking causes DNA damage. But I did some internet searching, and it seems like almost anything that anybody wants to stigmatize causes DNA damage. Now, of course, to the layman, DNA damage sounds terrible, but I found research purporting to show that drinking sugared sodas is DNA damage. Artificial sweetener in sodas causes DNA damage. Exposure to the sun even when the sun it has set. We're not talking about being on a beach in a hot sunny day, but just it can cause DNA damage. Stress causes DNA damage, according to these researchers. Fatty foods causes DNA damage. So my guess is that if you're looking for DNA damage, that if you're doing some kind of grant-funded research that wants to find DNA damage, you can probably find it anywhere you really want to look for it. And you can probably find, my guess is, and I am not someone who is very knowledgeable about DNA damage, but my guess is that time causes DNA damage. That simply, if you take a person today and then you look at the person 24 hours later, where time has passed, and you have instruments that are sensitive enough that you will be able to find some DNA damage. So I think it's not just for smoking, but for a lot of the kind of science that is being used to influence human behavior is not scientific. It's based on often having very, very sensitive instruments that can find some kind of change that seems to happen at the same time something else happens. Like you get exposed to secondhand smoke and there is DNA damage, or you are stressed out and there's DNA damage. Thank you for watching the smoking section. We'll be on next week. I hope to have a guest. Take care.